the present scaremongering, if you want, and so it's just a continuation of what happened in the 80s, and that Sweden was a very ideal test ground for this kind of operation by presenting the Soviet Union and Russia then as a very dangerous threat that were, almost coming to attack you. Then the US, the European states would lean much more to US, and you could also even say that if this didn't happen, the US would be a regular economic power with no hegemonic influence over Europe.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm speaking to Dr. Ola Tunander, an emeritus professor at the Peace Research Institute Oslo in Norway. Professor Tunander has written and edited various books and a number of articles on security politics, naval strategy, submarine operations, geopolitics, psychological operations, and Cold War history. In particular, he is the author of the book The Secret War Against Sweden, US and British Submarine Deceptions in the 1980s. This kind of PSYOPs in Europe is what we want to discuss today. So, Professor Tunander, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ola, you have written this fascinating book, I think in 2004, about the submarine issue in the coast of Sweden. And this was new to me. I wasn't aware that there were so many submarine sightings and that people got very jumpy about it. But this is a very dense issue. Could you maybe introduce it to us, and especially to people who don't know anything about the story? And what exactly is the story about these submarine sightings?
Yeah, no, you could say it started with a Soviet submarine in 1981, so went up on an island, which was a pretty strange thing. But after that, it was huge amount of sightings of submarines in Swedish waters, and inside the archipelagos and inside naval bases and inside the big harbors and so on, which is, pretty strange, because that is not the way a submarine should operate. And also they operated in areas where regular submarines could not go. So the whole thing was very strange, really, from the beginning. But it was clear every newspaper, every political leader, and every military officer said this is Soviet submarines, because what else could it be, So it was obvious for everyone that these was Soviet submarines, and in 3 years there was a change in totally the perception of threat in Sweden changed from 25-30% perceiving the Soviet Union as a threat or a kind of unfriendly state to 83%. So Sweden became a different country in just 3 years' time, and large part of the media, the first pages of the newspapers and so on, was about these submarine intrusions, and so this is not just changed the mentality of Sweden and to some extent Norway and Denmark. It also means that the Swedes should rely more on the Western allies. It became clear that Soviet Union appeared very much as a threat, and some people wrote in the daily newspapers that they thought that this was going on almost every day. It was one naval officer, commander, who said that on the Swedish TV news that this is going on every day. It's not. We just see the top of the iceberg, and so it was a clear understanding that the Soviets were preparing for a war against Sweden. And this was primarily in the early 1980s, but it went on all the way in the whole 1980s, actually.
And the point is that these submarine sightings, the sightings were real, right? People saw periscopes, people saw parts of submarines at the coasts of Sweden. But the provenance of these submarines was never actually truly understood, or like in your book you actually write about you clear it up, but where did they come from?
Yeah. No, it was it was a first submarine inquiry in 1983, stating that it was probably 6 Soviet submarine had intruded into Swedish waters, into naval bases and into the Stockholm harbor and so on. And then it was pushed for, and it was a strong protest from Sweden, from the Prime Minister Olof Palme, protested against the Soviet intrusions and so on. And but he was informed in August 83 by Koivisto, the President Koivisto, who had talks with Andropov, the leader in Soviet Union, who said that tell the Swedes that they should sink all these submarines, and then they would see what it is, because it's not ours. And of course, this made Olof Palme worried and confused. And then a friend of mine, who was his father was a state secretary for defense for 10 years, actually. And he was at a meeting in 1st December 83. And then he told his son, who was then international secretary in the Social Democratic Youth Organization, he told his son that the submarines were actually from the West. And this Carl Frithiofson, who was a state secretary for 10 years, he had a meeting with Olof Palme the same day and the day after. So he must have told Olof Palme that these submarines actually, so most likely, were from the West. And then you had some other, it was one journalist writing a book, had Anders Hasselboom. He found that people he spoke on the military side said that actually they were Western submarines, not Russian. And and the chief of army said publicly then in 87 that he was informed that 2 submarines had went out from through the Danish Straits, also out from the Baltic Sea, which means that it would not be a Soviet submarine. And he didn't know what nationality they had, but he spoke out publicly that these must have been Western submarines. And one was supposedly damaged also. So, and this was in 87, and then when I was in a 3rd submarine inquiry as a civilian expert, and I was reading a lot of documents, and the former chief of intelligence had made a report to the Prime Minister 87, saying 87, 88 actually, saying that you have these 2 types of small submarines operating in Swedish waters, and there is no indication that they are Soviet. The Soviets do not have this kind of small submarines. I mean, they had small submarines, but not the kind of types of submarines, because they have quite the description of how they looked like was rather detailed, actually. You had one small that were drop shaped 10 meters long, and one that were 20 to 30 meters long, regular submarine, and with regular submarine sail, and with a high snorkel mast behind the sail, which is very unusual, and which is very typical for a very specific Italian submarine. And so that made me also look more into these details, and I also had talks with people. I mean, I gave some lectures also in US at the Naval Postgraduate School and Center for Naval Analysis, and one man from Robert Bathurst, he was married with a Norwegian wife, and she wanted to go back to Norway because of her father getting old, and I fixed an office at our institute for Robert, and he was very cautious when he spoke about these things, but he had been Chief Naval Intelligence Europe in the early 70s, and he was attaché in Moscow, assistant attaché in mid 60s, actually. So he's a couple of years older than we are, and but he said that Bobby Inman, who is still alive, said he had a deal with the Swedes when he was attaché in Stockholm, and Robert used to go visit him, and he said that he had a deal with the Swedes on setting up hydrophones to find out about the Russian or Soviet submarines, and they were able to follow the activity perfectly well with this where the Soviet submarines were, but the problem was that they couldn't have, as in Norway, for example, you have a cable to land, that you have a station where you could listen to what happens at hydrophones, or if there is any submarine passing by and so on. And the problem was that they could not have this cable station because you couldn't get a go-ahead for these hydrophones from the prime minister. So that means that you had to have they were sending signals to a patrol aircraft passing by, and you had to have small submarine to maintain these hydrophones, and that started already from late 1960s. And when Robert was heading Naval Intelligence Europe in the early 70s, this system functioned. So he reported every morning at 7 o'clock to the admiral, the US admiral for Naval Forces Europe, about where all the surface ships and all the submarines, Soviet submarines, were, because they knew. And that's the problem was now, of course, that this system was extremely secret. But I have 6 sources actually that told about these hydrophones, and one guy said that they had picked one up in the fishing net, actually, so that he had looked at they didn't know then what it was, but I mean, it was clearly, it was not a Soviet hydrophone, so to speak. So it was a but he was at the defense material responsible for submarine operations. So he had described it in detail, how it looked like, and how it functions also, and that was but that means that when the Americans in the early 80s became fed up with the Swedes or the Scandinavians, more or less. I mean, it was the Norwegian prime minister in his New Year's speech 1981, he spoke about the possibility of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Nordic countries. And the Americans and the British went ballistic. I mean, this was totally unacceptable. And you had to speak serious with the Norwegians, and the Swedes were even worse. So it was the Norwegians were out on a slippery slope, as it was in one British Foreign Office document that I saw, some declassified documents, and it was clear that the British were extremely upset about how the Nordic countries behaved, that they were not loyal enough.
Yeah, maybe we just need to make it clear. This is a moment in time when Norway was a member of NATO. Sweden and Finland were, of course, both neutral. The well, Iceland and Denmark, they were part of NATO, but especially the Norwegians were very strict to what kind of weapon systems or so on could be stationed on their soil, and they were together with Finland. They were rather in favor of a Nordic nuclear-free zone, right? This was something that was coming up at the time. This idea of nuclear-free zones.
But the security elite in Norway was clearly against. I mean, they were upset, and actually the foreign minister were not informed when sorry, when the prime minister gave this New Year's speech, so which was so he got the U.S. State Secretary Alexander Haig, was furious when he spoke with Knut Frydenlund, who was the foreign minister, and the foreign minister said that we have a public opinion in Norway, and we have to speak to them and so on, but it won't happen. You don't have to worry about it. But but still, they were not. The British and Americans were not happy with the behavior on the Norwegian side and primarily on the Swedish side. So they were. So this became a very. I mean, afterwards you could say that it clear these submarines, they were British and they were under American command. It was these Italian vessels that, you could just, they had been there for 10 years. I mean, they had not been there for 10 years. They were brought in on merchant ships. If you have seen this film from James Bond, there is one film about that that the submarine goes into a ship and disappears into the ship and so on, and that's what it is about. I mean, they had got the idea from somewhere already then. So it was it functioned with very small vessels also during the Second World War. Italy had this, and Italy had a large number of very good small vessels that could be used for this purpose. And if you look at how the submarines are described in Swedish archipelagos and naval bases and so on, it's clearly these Italian ones. And I even asked John Lehman, actually, who was the Secretary of Navy, because I was at a conference with him. And he said, yes, we used this Italian for plausible deniability. So, which means in praxis that it's not there is no physical evidence pointing to United States. It's and you know how the Italians are, you know.
But that means, to your mind, despite we don't have an official admission, right, by any of these states that they used submarines in the Baltic at that time, but to your mind, it is clear that this was a PSYOP by NATO states to scare the Nordic population into supporting anti-Soviet policies. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's a little bit more. You could say that actually in 2000, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, also he was Secretary of Defense in the 1980s. But he said in 2000 on a Swedish TV documentary, some 40 minutes documentary, and he spoke for several minutes about that we actually operated submarines in Swedish waters regularly and frequently. And that was necessary because it increased the readiness on the Swedish side, and it was necessary for us, and it was necessary for the Swedes, because the Swedes were also collaborating closely with the Americans. I mean, some Swedes, put it that way. It was Sweden was in a sense divided, and I've written about this quite a lot, actually, about the dual state. And so the Sweden, I first more clearly understood it in the conference when I spoke with James Schlesinger, who was a Secretary of Defense in the 70s under Nixon, and he was also heading the CIA before that. And he when I asked about his time in the administration, how they looked at Sweden, and he said, which Sweden? The political Sweden or the military Sweden? The military planned for us to come as soon as possible. And that means in a war, actually. So it means that in case of Soviet forces going into West Germany or something like that, the U.S. airplane had to go somewhere. U.S. airplanes in West Germany, and the best place to go is to Sweden. So Sweden should receive, and that was at least then Defense Minister Sven Andersson's view, that Sweden should receive these aircraft already before Sweden were attacked by Soviet Union. And but this policy was not handed over to the new prime minister by Olof Palme in 1976. So Olof Palme was prime minister 69 to 76, I think, and then 82 to 86 when he was shot. So it's so this means that the idea from this military elite was that we should receive aircraft, the US aircraft, already before the Soviets have attacked us. And this was not the policy of the political Sweden. So in that sense, Sweden was totally divided. So you had one part, one elite, or I don't know how many people, but I asked John Lehman at this conference. I spoke 2007, I think, that which Swedes were involved in this, and then he said, "No, I can't tell you that, because then I have to kill you afterwards." And it was so he was very, I mean, it was a joke, but it was probably serious in some one way or another. Also, because this was very, very sensitive. But he was willing to say that these operations that Caspar Weinberger has spoken about in 2000, that these were decided about by a deception committee under Bill Casey. So it was Bill Casey who was chairing the committee, and then it was the head of the National Security Advisor, Dick Allen, and then it was undersecretaries, I think, of State and Defense. So this, and they took the decision because they wanted the president, the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense should have plausible deniability. They knew probably, but they shouldn't have. They should be able to say that they didn't know anything.
You know, this strikes me, this story, as something so important, because there's this idea, of course, that NATO states and NATO itself is a purely defensive alliance that looks out for its members and is also equal, right? Everybody has an equal say in it, and nobody is forced into NATO. Everybody chooses this by themselves. At least that's the grand narrative that, especially in the last couple of years, we've been fed time and again. Everybody is free to choose their alliances. But your research just shows beautifully that the scaremongering on NATO's side has, at least for 40, if not 50 years, been tremendous in order to consolidate military policy, especially around the Baltic Sea.
Yeah, but formally speaking, it was not NATO. It was
not NATO, no, but NATO countries, right?
It was US and Britain. And I spoke with Vidlek Eide, Norwegian general, who was this was in around 2000, and about this what Caspar Weinberger had said and so on, and he said that yes, but this was US and British operations. They were, because you could not have it inside NATO, because that the risk for a leak would be tremendous. Actually, you couldn't. It was of course, you have committees. You have committees, that the Allied Clandestine Committee and Special Operation Planning Staff and so on inside NATO, where most people didn't know about and were running these stay-behinds, for example, and so on. So and they were running submarines also into Swedish waters. And I spoke with one German representative from these committees, Volbert Schmid, And he said that, yes, we had this, we had submarines, British submarines actually, primarily, I think, landing special forces for training with Swedish and Norwegian stay-behinds. But he said these submarines were never visible. So these were not the submarines that appeared in Swedish archipelagos and naval bases and so on. But they went into Swedish territorial waters and to Swedish archipelagos also, actually. But they did not. It was a British, actually, after Caspar Weinberger had made this statement on Swedish TV, the British former Navy minister, Keith Speed, said almost the same. We did it, and it was necessary. And we could go almost, into Stockholm Harbor and surface to see how, if you were able to track us. And that was but both Weinberger and Keith Speed said this was a Navy-to-Navy operations. It was the US Navy speaking with the Swedish representatives, and it was the British Navy speaking with the Swedish representatives in the Swedish Navy. And he said also that it was the flag officer submarines and the chief of defense staff that spoke with his Swedish counterpart, which you could easily see who it was. And this was the same person who ordered ceasefires when a submarine was on its way out and so on. So you could say it's clear that, but what happened then was that, it was a top layer of admirals who knew what happened. But the regular naval officers, they thought it was Soviet submarines. And they started a kind of, some people started a kind of revolt against the prime minister, which is, as a naval officer, you are not supposed to start a revolt against the prime minister. But that they actually also discussed that they should take him out to kill him.
We're talking about Olof Palme now, right?
We're talking about Olof Palme, yes, because they were thinking that he was a traitor and that he collaborated with the Soviets and they let Soviet submarines out. While you could see now in the documents from the time that the orders were given by a couple of very specific admirals.
So the suspicion of like lower ranking officers, Swedish officers, was that there were these Soviet submarines that were spying on the Swedish coast, and the fact that they did not get the authorization to shoot those down must have come directly from Olof Palme, who's in bed with the Soviets. That was the thinking. When in fact, matter of fact, it was friendly submarines from friendly nations that were doing operations with the full knowledge of the general staff of the Navy, at least of a couple of people, and they concealed who this was. And that's this internal tension in Sweden of, playing with the unknown in order to create a general understanding that, we need more protection. Or let me ask a question. Do you think the primary objective of this operation was the psychological effect, or was it Navy to Navy trying to, cat and mouse game, see how far you can go? Naval readiness, or was it the PSYOP that was actually intended?
I think the decision was taken by Case's Deception Committee, which indicated it was a PSYOP as a major issue. But when Caspar Weinberger spoke about it, it was presented, and you could say this was a cover-up, but it was not a very good cover-up for the Swedish public. But it was where he said it was necessary to increase the readiness on the Swedish side, and we have to do this training, these exercises in Swedish waters. So this was so you have different layers, you could say, and but on the top level, it's psychological operations actually, and you could, it's clearly the way they were thinking also when you listen to them.
Sweden, of course, has been under a neutrality policy for 200 years, or was under a neutrality policy for 200 years, in one way or another. And it was never kind of a committed neutrality that the kind of Sweden or Austria, the Switzerland and Austria, but it was more a lack of other options, like time and again. So do you think that the ultimate demise of Sweden's neutrality actually goes back all the way to the 1980s and this change of hearts that was brought about through these ships?
Yeah, you actually had already from the 60s a close collaboration between military forces and I think not least on the when it comes to the air forces, and you also had, you know, Wallenberg, the sub, they made the Swedish aircraft sub, and they had very close ties to the Americans, and they had intelligence. Carl Arvid Norlin, who was an intelligence operator for the Wallenberg company, and were very close to the Americans and able to get American technology for the Swedish sub aircraft and so on. But when Bobby Inman was assistant attaché in Sweden in the mid 60s, he used Carl Arvid Norlin as his go-between to the Swedish defense minister. So, and Bobby Inman was actually working 2 days a week at the Swedish defense ministry as an American attaché. So which is a surprise. but the idea was that they should find out what the Soviet submarines did, and that was when they also were able to have these hydrophones, to deploy these hydrophones along the Swedish coast. So, but already from the 60s, you could say it was part of the establishment was very close to the Americans, and they were not, in that sense, close to NATO as an organization, because that it was bilateral relationships, but also to the British actually. So when it comes to the stay-behinds, they were very close to the British. So it's and that was already, I think, the Americans and the British, they always knew how to go into you could say, infiltrate the state, to have close ties to people and develop these close ties often on a private side. So it was, so for example, the Swedish chief of navy in the early 80s, he went on holiday with Bobby Inman family. So it's this developed into very, very close ties between individuals. And these were a way, I think they actually were able to it became a question of trust. And so the Norwegian chief of defense, he told me that in the 70s, he met the Swedish chief of defense, and they were going skiing together. And that was, and the most important things were trust. I mean, what was written on the paper was not actually the major thing. The major thing was personal trust. And that was, but that made it also more problematic, you could say, when it comes to if you not follow the rules and go public, for example, and doing things, there is no legal way to punish you. So it means that the only way is physical. So that and you could say that that is maybe one aspect of the murder of Olof Palme, that he was taken out because he was unacceptable, and he knew also very much. I mean, he had been the central person for the Swedish nuclear weapons program in the 1950s, early 60s, and so on. And he was also his close colleague Birger Elmér was heading the intelligence service, a secret intelligence service that controlled the regular military intelligence service. So it was so they would not go totally American. So the idea was, in a way, that you had, one friend of mine described the meetings he had with, he was in the Swedish intelligence, deputy intelligence for the defense staff intelligence, Björn Eklind. And he said that he had meetings with foreign intelligence people, but it was this information bureau, so to speak, the secret intelligence service, who arranged the meetings. And he was not allowed to know the names of the people, of his counterparts. So it was an attempt, you could say, to control the Swedish military and intelligence service, so they would not be totally infiltrated by the Americans, you could say.
Yeah, I was about to ask. So there were Swedish intelligence that knew that infiltration danger is actually emanating from Britain and the United States. The Soviet Union was a direct military threat, but there's another threat on the other side, which is like very paradigmatic, because neutral states are usually under threat by both parties who want them to be closer to them and more friendly to them.
Yeah. No, so
especially especially like Sweden, because Sweden is a linchpin in the Nordic constellation. A Finnish colleague told me yesterday, Stockholm is the center of the Nordics, right? It's even for the Finn, as a Finn, he would describe it as such.
At least that is the way the Swedes would think about it. It was Finland was part of Sweden for, I guess, 600 years or something like that. So this was so in that sense, Stockholm was also geographically in the center. Estonia and Latvia was, part of Sweden, and so it was so in that sense, historically speaking, Sweden were thinking about itself as a core country of the Nordic states, actually. And that was, but also when it comes to neutrality policy, this was very important in a sense because it was a relaxation of the tension in the Northern Europe. And actually, Gorbachev, when he pushed for a neutral Central Europe, this was also influenced by the Palme Commission and the Nordic countries, because he already in late '88 his close colleague, a close advisor on economy, Bogomolov, wrote about the possibility of a neutral Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And that was, and I asked the Russian side then immediately afterwards, and he said that yes, this is Gorbachev policy. So that was and that was already from January. When I spoke with him, it was already from January '89 that one wanted to have a neutral Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary as a kind of buffer zone between the great powers, and then you could possibly have more of a Nordification of Central Europe, you could say, with a neutral Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and more of a Norwegian solution, maybe to Western Germany. But he wanted, at that time, to have some forces still in East Germany to avoid a larger Germany. That was the case.
But would you say that your research contributes to the body of knowledge that shows that a neutralized buffer between the Soviet Union and later Russia and Western Europe was actually never something that the United States wanted, and also the British, that they actively worked against this on an operational level to make sure that there are, even if countries call themselves neutral, that they would remain loyal to their side much more than let's say function as a buffer.
Yeah, no, I think so. It is when you read the documents from the Bush administration, there was one historian, I've forgotten his name now, but he wrote about the Baker's policy. I mean, Baker said that not 1 inch to the east and so on. And but at the same time, Scowcroft, who was the national security advisor, said that US should place itself between Soviet Union and Germany. So it was also in Poland, you could say, or Central Europe, that so the idea was that, but these people didn't speak very loud at the time, so they let Baker speak about the kind of that one should not extend the NATO, which would mean in practice a neutral Central Europe. But when you look at what the other side of the same administration said, and also there are statements by Baker that he actually said it not, he did not really mean what he said.
Yeah.
So it was a clearly false play.
Yeah, dishonest at best and lies at worst. But maybe for the last couple of minutes, Ola, like, if you compare your research from the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, the Cold War period, with what we are seeing today in this proxy war that's going on and in Europe, do you see parallels? Do you see parallels to PSYOPs of the past and current scaremongering of populations in Europe?
Yeah. I think that in certain respect, you could say that the present scaremongering, if you want, and so is just a continuation of what happened in the 80s, and that Sweden was a very ideal test ground for this kind of operation, and that you could have by presenting the Soviet Union and Russia then as a very dangerous threat that were, almost coming to attack you, then the US, the European states would lean much more to US, and you could also even say that if this didn't happen, the US would be a regular economic power with no hegemonic influence over Europe. So actually, I think this has been the policy all along.
And it's continuing. It's continuing. The scaremongering and the threat inflation on the other side, even with outright deceptions, is happening in front of our eyes. But is it getting a little bit more obvious to you now? Because what happened with Nord Stream first was pinned at Russia immediately, although it makes zero sense, no sense. It still makes no sense. But it's getting a bit more obvious now, doesn't it? Are they losing their edge in scaremongering, or am I just not seeing it?
I don't. I think that after this Weinberger interview, and the Swedish public, I think it was 60% or something like that, said that it were probably Western submarines, at least Western submarines and so on. In 2014, it was new occasion of a submarine intrusion, where no one really knows what it was, but it was certainly not Russians. But that was what it was presented as, and all what was known for 15 years before was forgotten. So one should not underestimate the capability of these friends.
Yeah. I mean, as Jeffrey Sachs says, usually quoting that others, that having the US as an enemy is dangerous, but having the US as a friend can be fatal.
Yeah, Kissinger, I guess.
Kissinger said it. Yes, right.
Yeah.
Good. Ola, like your research is very relevant. I will link the book in the description. You also have a Substack, right, for people who want to read your newest writings?
I think that when it comes to the book, it's quite old. I mean, the English book is quite old. I have some Swedish books that are new, but the Substacks are partly from. It's quite new things, actually.
Okay. I will link all of that in the description. Everybody, please, if you're interested, follow Professor Ola Tunander on this. Ola, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.